I never thought moving into the pristine neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates in Scottsdale, Arizona would turn my life into a legal drama. But that was before I met Brenda Zimmerman. The whole thing started on a Tuesday morning in late March when I was out watering my desert landscaping. I had just moved into my new place 3 months prior, a beautiful adobe-style home with a red tile roof that I had saved up for years to afford. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looked vaguely similar, but different enough to maintain some individuality. Palm trees lined the streets, and the HOA fees were steep but supposedly worth it for the maintained common areas and strict aesthetic standards that kept property values high. I was minding my own business, adjusting the drip irrigation system around my barrel cacti, when a silver Lexus SUV pulled up to the curb in front of my house. Out stepped a woman in her mid-50s with a blonde bob that looked like it had been shellacked into place with industrial-strength hairspray. She wore white capri pants, a floral blouse, and oversized sunglasses despite the fact that it was barely 8 in the morning. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that immediately put me on edge. "Are you aware that your trash cans are visible from the street?" I looked over at my side yard, where my 2 standard-issue trash cans sat behind a decorative lattice screen, barely visible unless you were actively looking for them. "They're behind a screen," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "The HOA rules clearly state that all refuse containers must be completely invisible from any public right-of-way," she said, walking up my driveway without invitation. "I'm Brenda Zimmerman, HOA president. We take our community standards very seriously here." I wiped my hands on my jeans and extended one for a handshake. "Jason Reynolds. Nice to meet you, I guess. The cans are pretty well hidden already, but I can look into moving them if it's really an issue." She ignored my outstretched hand and pulled out her phone, snapping several photos of my side yard. "It is really an issue. You'll be receiving a formal violation notice in the mail. First offense is a warning, but subsequent violations will result in fines." "For trash cans that are already screened?" I asked, feeling my jaw tighten. "For trash cans that are visible," she corrected, emphasizing each word like she was talking to a child. "I suggest you remedy the situation within the 7-day grace period. Good day." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus, leaving me standing in my driveway, wondering what I had just gotten myself into. I later learned from my neighbor, Phil Martinez, that Brenda had been HOA president for 6 years and ran the association like her own personal fiefdom. She lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling 5,000-square-foot mansion on the corner lot at the end of Saguaro Boulevard. True to her word, I received the violation notice 3 days later. It included photos of my side yard, citations of specific HOA covenant sections, and a deadline for compliance. I moved the trash cans to my garage, which meant they now sat next to where I parked my car and made getting in and out more annoying, but I figured it wasn't worth the fight. That should have been the end of it, but it was really just the beginning. Over the next 2 months, Brenda found reasons to cite me for violations on 6 separate occasions. My garden hose was coiled incorrectly and visible from the sidewalk. My welcome mat was the wrong shade of brown and didn't match the approved color palette. I had placed a small decorative weather vane in my front rock garden that apparently constituted an unapproved lawn ornament. My car was parked in my driveway instead of my garage for more than the 24-hour maximum period because I had been detailing it over a weekend. Each violation came with photos, formal letters, and increasingly threatening language about fines and liens. I attended my first HOA board meeting in early June, hoping to address what I felt was targeted harassment. The meeting was held in the community center, a stucco building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a gym and pool facility. About 20 homeowners were scattered among the folding chairs, and Brenda sat at a table up front with 3 other board members who seemed to defer to her on every decision. When the floor opened for homeowner comments, I stood up and calmly explained that I felt I was being unfairly targeted with violation notices for minor issues, while I had observed other properties with what seemed like more obvious violations that went unaddressed. Brenda's smile never reached her eyes. "Mr. Reynolds, the board takes all violations seriously. If you believe other properties are in violation, you're welcome to submit formal complaints, and we'll investigate accordingly. However, I assure you that your citations have been entirely warranted and in keeping with our covenant standards. I've gotten 6 notices in 2 months, I said. That seems excessive for someone who's trying to comply with every rule. Then perhaps you should familiarize yourself more thoroughly with the covenants you agreed to when you purchased your property, she replied. This community has standards, and we intend to maintain them. Now, if there's nothing else, we have quite a bit of agenda to cover. I sat down, fuming. A woman across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Don't bother, she does this to anyone she doesn't like. Just stay under the radar." But staying under the radar became impossible when Brenda decided to install her fence. It started in mid-July, right in the peak of Arizona's summer heat, when temperatures regularly hit 115 degrees. I was working from home in my air-conditioned office when I heard the sound of construction equipment. Looking out my window, I saw a truck from Desert Barrier Fencing parked on the street in front of Brenda's house, which was diagonal from mine and slightly down the hill. Workers were unloading materials, and Brenda was standing in her front yard, gesturing animatedly. By the afternoon, the scope of the project became clear. Brenda was having a solid 8-foot-tall wooden fence installed along the entire front property line of her corner lot. The fence was made of dark-stained cedar planks with no gaps between them, creating an imposing wall between her property and the sidewalk. It wrapped around both street-facing sides of her corner lot, meaning it ran along Saguaro Boulevard and down Ocotillo Drive. Phil came over that evening with 2 beers, and we stood on my front porch watching the construction continue under portable lights. "That's got to be against HOA rules," Phil said, shaking his head. "I wanted to put up a 3-foot decorative fence around my back patio, and the board rejected it because it wasn't on the approved materials list." "How tall did you say hers is?" I asked. "Got to be 8 feet, maybe more in some spots because of the slope." I went inside and pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants, something I had become intimately familiar with thanks to Brenda's constant citations. I flipped to Section 7, which covered fencing and property barriers. Phil read over my shoulder as I ran my finger down the page. "Here," I said. Section 7.3. All fencing visible from public streets or common areas must be of approved materials and design. Maximum height for front yard fencing is 4 feet, and material must allow at least 40% visual transparency to maintain the open character of the community. "She's got a solid 8-foot fence going up right now," Phil said. "That's double the height limit and 0 transparency." Section 7.5, I continued. All fencing projects require advance approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Homeowners must submit detailed plans, material samples, and elevation drawings no less than 30 days prior to construction. "Did she submit plans?" Phil asked. "If she did, there's no way the committee approved that fence," I said. "It violates at least 3 major provisions." We watched as the workers continued installing fence panels in the dark. By the time they packed up for the night around 9, they had completed about 60 feet of the fence along Saguaro Boulevard. The next morning, I drove slowly past Brenda's house to get a better look. The fence was even more imposing in daylight, a solid wall of dark wood that completely blocked the view of her front yard and house from the street. In a neighborhood that prided itself on its open, desert landscaping aesthetic, it looked like someone had erected a military fortification. I wasn't the only one who noticed. By that afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook group was blowing up with comments. People were posting photos and asking questions. A few homeowners pointed out the obvious violations. Others wondered how Brenda had gotten approval for something so clearly against the rules. One person suggested maybe she had received a variance for privacy reasons. The construction continued for 3 more days. By Friday afternoon, Brenda had a complete fortress surrounding her corner lot. The fence ran approximately 200 feet along Saguaro Boulevard and another 150 feet down Ocotillo Drive. It was exactly 8 feet tall, made of solid cedar planks with decorative post caps, and must have cost a fortune. That evening, I received an email from the HOA. My heart sank, expecting another violation notice. Instead, it was a mass message to all homeowners announcing that the board had received inquiries about a recent fencing installation and wanted to clarify that the property owner had submitted plans and received full approval. The email was signed by Brenda Zimmerman, HOA president. I immediately called Phil. "Did you see the email?" "Just read it," he said. "That's complete garbage. There's no way that fence meets the covenant requirements, approval or not." "Can she just approve her own plans?" I asked. "Technically, the Architectural Review Committee is supposed to be separate from the board, but Brenda basically controls both. Her friend Sandra chairs the ARC, and she rubber stamps whatever Brenda wants." I spent that weekend reading through the HOA covenants, bylaws, and articles of incorporation. What I found was interesting. While the board had broad authority to manage the association, they couldn't simply ignore the covenants. The covenants were legally binding restrictions that ran with the land, and they could only be changed through a vote of the membership. The board could approve or deny projects based on the covenants, but they couldn't approve something that clearly violated them. On Monday morning, I drafted a formal complaint. I cited the specific covenant sections that Brenda's fence violated, included photos showing the height and solid construction, and requested that the board enforce the rules and require the fence to be removed or modified to comply with the 4-foot height limit and transparency requirements. I submitted my complaint through the HOA's online portal and also sent copies via email and certified mail to make sure there was a clear paper trail. The response came within 24 hours. Brenda sent a terse email stating that my complaint had been reviewed and deemed without merit. The fence had been approved through proper channels and met all applicable standards. No further action would be taken. I forwarded the exchange to Phil, who suggested I attend the next board meeting and raise the issue publicly. The meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of July. I arrived 15 minutes early and was surprised to see the community center meeting room already half full. Apparently, word had spread, and other homeowners were also interested in the fence situation. Brenda started the meeting by announcing that due to the large turnout, she was implementing a 3-minute limit on homeowner comments and limiting the discussion of any single topic to 15 minutes total. When we got to the homeowner comment period, I was the first to stand up. "I'm here to discuss the fence recently installed at 1847 Saguaro Boulevard," I began. "According to Section 7.3 of our covenants, front yard fences are limited to 4 feet in height and must have at least 40% transparency. The fence in question is 8 feet tall and completely solid. I filed a formal complaint that was dismissed without explanation. I'd like to know how a fence that so clearly violates our covenants was approved." Brenda folded her hands on the table. "As I stated in my response to your complaint, Mr. Reynolds, the fence was properly approved. The property owner submitted detailed plans that were reviewed by the Architectural Review Committee and found to be acceptable." "Acceptable based on what standard?" I pressed. "The covenants are very clear about the height and transparency requirements." "The board has discretion in interpreting and applying the covenants," Brenda said. "We determined that the fence serves important privacy and security functions and that the property owner had legitimate reasons for the design. So the board can just ignore the covenants whenever they want," another homeowner called out. "We're not ignoring anything," Brenda snapped. "We're exercising our judgment in administering the community standards. Now, unless there are other topics to discuss, I think we've spent enough time on this matter." "I'm not done," I said, still standing. "I want to know specifically what provision in the covenants or bylaws gives the board authority to approve a fence that's double the maximum height." Brenda's face was reddening. "Your 3 minutes are up, Mr. Reynolds. Please sit down." "You haven't answered my question." "I don't have to answer to you," she said, her voice rising. "I'm the president of this association, and I determine what gets approved. If you don't like it, you can take it up with an attorney." The room went silent. Even her fellow board members looked uncomfortable. An older gentleman in the back stood up. "Madam President, I think the homeowner has raised legitimate questions. Perhaps we could have the association attorney provide an opinion on whether the fence complies with the covenants." "That won't be necessary," Brenda said. "The board has already made its determination. Meeting adjourned." She stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the other board members sitting awkwardly at the table. I left the meeting more convinced than ever that Brenda had simply used her position to exempt herself from the rules she so zealously enforced against everyone else. The question was what to do about it. Over the next week, I researched Arizona HOA law. I learned that homeowners had the right to petition for a vote to recall board members and that covenants were enforceable contracts that could be enforced through the courts if the association refused to act. I also learned that board members who acted in bad faith or for personal benefit could potentially be held personally liable for damages. I decided my first step would be to see if other homeowners wanted to join me in taking formal action. I created a simple online petition laying out the facts about the fence, the covenant violations, and the board's refusal to enforce the rules. I posted it in the neighborhood Facebook group with a note that I was exploring legal options and wanted to gauge community interest. The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, I had signatures from 73 homeowners, representing almost 40% of the neighborhood. Many left comments about their own negative experiences with Brenda's enforcement actions. Several people shared stories about requests they had made for minor modifications that had been denied while Brenda's fence stood in clear violation. One comment particularly stood out. A homeowner named Douglas Chen wrote that he had been fined $2,000 for installing a 6-foot privacy fence around his backyard without approval, even though his fence wasn't visible from the street and was in the backyard where the height limits were more lenient. He had eventually paid the fine to avoid a lien on his property. Brenda had personally delivered the fine notice and told him that rules were rules. I compiled all the petition signatures and comments into a formal demand letter. I stated that the fence at 1847 Saguaro Boulevard was in clear violation of the HOA covenants, that the board had failed in its fiduciary duty to enforce the rules equally, and that if the issue wasn't resolved within 30 days, the undersigned homeowners would pursue legal action to compel enforcement and seek damages for breach of fiduciary duty. I had a lawyer friend review the letter to make sure the language was appropriate, then sent it via certified mail to the HOA board with copies to each individual board member at their home addresses. 3 days later, I received a violation notice in my mail. According to the notice, my front yard rock garden was excessively cluttered and violated the community aesthetic standards. I needed to remove at least half of the decorative rocks and replace them with approved ground cover within 14 days, or face a fine of $100 per day. My rock garden was virtually identical to a dozen other yards in the neighborhood. I took photos of 5 other properties within 2 blocks that had similar or more elaborate rock gardens. I submitted those photos with a response denying the violation and pointing out the selective enforcement. 2 days after that, I got another notice. This time, my house number plaque was allegedly the wrong font and needed to be replaced with an approved style. It was obvious what was happening. Brenda was retaliating against me for organizing the homeowners and sending the demand letter. I documented everything, keeping copies of all notices and taking time-stamped photos. My lawyer friend suggested that the retaliation actually strengthened any potential case, as it showed a pattern of abuse of power. The 30-day deadline in the demand letter came and went with no response from the board. I consulted with a law firm that specialized in HOA disputes. The attorney, Sarah Martinez, reviewed all my documentation and agreed that I had a strong case. She explained that I had 2 potential avenues. I could sue the HOA to compel enforcement of the covenants, or I could petition for a special meeting to recall the board. The legal route will be slower but more certain, Sarah explained. The recall route is faster, but requires you to convince enough homeowners to show up and vote. Given what you've told me about Brenda's control of the board, she'll fight a recall with everything she has. How long would a lawsuit take? I asked. 6 months to a year, possibly longer if they appeal, and it'll cost you probably $15,000 to $20,000, though you can seek to recover attorney fees if you win since you're enforcing the covenants. What about the recall? You need 20% of homeowners to sign a petition calling for a special meeting, then you need a majority vote at that meeting to remove board members. You've already got signatures from 40% on your enforcement petition, so getting the recall petition signed shouldn't be hard. The challenge is getting people to actually show up to vote. I talked it over with Phil and several other homeowners who had been most vocal in supporting the enforcement action. We decided to try the recall route first. It was faster, less expensive, and would send a clear message that the community wouldn't tolerate abuse of power. We drafted a recall petition that called for a special meeting to vote on removing Brenda Zimmerman as president and board member. We needed signatures from at least 40 homeowners based on the 200-unit development. We had 73 people who had already signed the enforcement petition, so we were confident we could hit the threshold. For the next 2 weeks, I spent every evening walking the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and explaining the situation. Most people were supportive, though some were afraid of retaliation. A few told me they just wanted to avoid drama, but by mid-September, I'd collected signatures from 96 homeowners, almost half the community. I submitted the recall petition to the board via certified mail and email. According to the bylaws, the board had to schedule a special meeting within 45 days of receiving a valid petition. Brenda's response was to hire a lawyer. The association attorney sent a letter claiming the petition was procedurally defective because it hadn't been submitted on the proper form. This was nonsense, as the bylaws didn't specify any particular form, but it gave Brenda an excuse to delay. Sarah Martinez sent a response on my behalf, backed by the other petitioning homeowners, pointing out that the bylaws required only a written petition signed by 20% of owners. She threatened to seek a court order compelling the meeting if the board continued to obstruct. Faced with the threat of judicial intervention, Brenda finally scheduled the special meeting for October 28th, a Thursday evening at 6 p.m. The weeks leading up to the meeting were tense. Brenda sent multiple emails to all homeowners defending her record and claiming that the recall effort was being led by a disgruntled homeowner who wanted to undermine community standards. She organized a counter-campaign, posting signs around the neighborhood urging people to support your HOA board and stop the troublemakers. I focused on facts. I created a simple one-page flyer with photos of Brenda's fence next to the relevant covenant language. I included quotes from homeowners who had been fined or had requests denied for minor issues. I hand-delivered the flyers to every house in the neighborhood. The day before the meeting, Brenda made one last play. She sent an email announcing that the board had decided to voluntarily modify the fence to bring it into compliance with the covenants. She claimed this showed the board's commitment to fairness and suggested that the recall was therefore unnecessary. I immediately drove past her house. The fence was unchanged. I took fresh photos and sent an email to all the homeowners pointing out that no actual modifications had been made and that this appeared to be a last-minute attempt to avoid accountability. The night of the meeting, I arrived at the community center an hour early. Sarah Martinez came with me, as did Phil and about a dozen other homeowners who had been helping organize the recall effort. We set up a table near the entrance with sign-in sheets and copies of the proxy forms for homeowners who couldn't attend but wanted their votes counted. By 5:30, the parking lot was full. By 5:45, people were parking on the street. I had never seen this many homeowners engaged in association business. The meeting room filled to capacity, and we had to move to the larger gymnasium to accommodate everyone. Brenda arrived at 5 minutes to 6, flanked by her attorney and the 3 other board members. She looked stunned at the turnout. I counted at least 130 people in the room, representing over 60% of the community. The meeting was called to order, and the recall vote was the only item on the agenda. Brenda's attorney tried to make a procedural argument that proxies weren't valid for recall votes, but Sarah shot that down by citing the specific bylaw provision that allowed proxies for any member vote. Then came the actual debate. According to the bylaws, the homeowners who initiated the recall could speak for up to 10 minutes explaining the reasons. Then the board member facing recall could respond for 10 minutes, followed by open comments from the floor. I was chosen to present the case for recall. I walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding, and laid out the situation as clearly and factually as I could. I explained how Brenda's fence violated multiple covenant provisions. I showed photos comparing her 8-foot solid fence to the 4-foot transparency requirements. I cited examples of other homeowners who had been fined or denied for far less significant violations. I presented the evidence of retaliation against me and others who had spoken up. Fine. This isn't about personal disputes or grudges, I concluded. It's about whether our HOA will enforce its rules fairly and equally, or whether board members can exempt themselves from the standards they impose on everyone else. A vote to recall is a vote for accountability and equal treatment. When I sat down, the room erupted in applause. Brenda's face was bright red. Her attorney advised her to keep her response brief and measured, but Brenda couldn't help herself. She launched into a 10-minute rant about how she had dedicated years of volunteer service to the community, how the neighborhood had never looked better, how property values were up, and how I was just a troublemaker who wanted to bring down community standards. "My fence is a matter of personal security," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I had legitimate safety concerns, and the board properly exercised its discretion in approving my design. If these people want to turn our neighborhood into a free-for-all with no standards, then vote for the recall. But don't come crying to me when your property values tank and the neighborhood goes to hell." The comment period was revealing. Homeowner after homeowner stood up to share their experiences. Douglas Chen talked about his $2,000 fine for his backyard fence. A woman named Patricia described how her request to plant bougainvillea had been denied as non-approved vegetation, while Brenda had 3 different varieties of bougainvillea in her yard. An elderly man recounted being cited for having his garage door open for more than 2 hours while he was organizing his workshop. A few people spoke in Brenda's defense, mostly friends of hers who praised her dedication and claimed the recall was unfair. But they were vastly outnumbered. When the comment period ended, it was time to vote. Ballots were distributed to every homeowner or proxy holder present. The question was simple. Should Brenda Zimmerman be removed as president and board member of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association? The ballot counting took about 30 minutes. Sarah and another attorney observed the count to ensure accuracy. The room buzzed with conversation while we waited. Finally, the results were announced. Of the 147 votes cast, 109 voted for removal. Brenda had been recalled by a margin of more than 2-1. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the room without a word. Her attorney followed, leaving the remaining board members looking shell-shocked. According to the bylaws, the remaining board members had to appoint an interim replacement within 30 days, and a proper election would be held at the next annual meeting. In the meantime, the vice president would assume presidential duties. As people filed out of the meeting, dozens of homeowners stopped to shake my hand and thank me. Phil clapped me on the shoulder. "We actually did it," he said, grinning. But the fight wasn't over. 3 days after the recall vote, I received a letter from Brenda's attorney demanding that I retract various defamatory statements I had allegedly made about her or face a lawsuit. Sarah reviewed the letter and said it was a standard intimidation tactic with no legal merit. More importantly, the fence was still standing. At the next regular board meeting in November, now chaired by the former Vice President Frank Morrison, I raised the enforcement issue again. "What? We need to give her a chance to voluntarily comply," Frank said diplomatically. "I'll send her a letter citing the violations and asking her to submit a plan for bringing the fence into compliance within 30 days. The letter was sent, but 30 days came and went with no response from Brenda. At the December meeting, Frank reported that the board had voted to impose a formal violation with a fine schedule if the fence wasn't modified or removed within 14 days. The violation notice sent to Brenda cited Section 7.3 and 7.5 of the covenants and required her to either reduce the fence height to 4 feet or less, modify it to meet the 40% transparency requirement, or remove it entirely. If she failed to comply within 14 days, she would be fined $100 per day until the violation was cured. Brenda responded through her attorney, claiming the fence had been properly approved and that the board was engaging in improper retroactive enforcement. Her lawyer threatened to sue the association if the fines were imposed. The board stood firm. When the 14-day deadline passed, daily fines began accruing. $100 per day added up quickly. After 2 weeks, Brenda owed $1,400. After a month, the total was $3,000. Brenda filed a lawsuit against the HOA in Maricopa County Superior Court, seeking an injunction against the fines and a declaration that her fence had been properly approved. The association hired a law firm to defend the case, paid for by the association's insurance policy. The legal proceedings dragged on through the winter. Brenda argued that she had obtained approval from the board when she was president, and that approval couldn't be retroactively revoked. The association argued that the board never had authority to approve something that clearly violated the covenants, and that any such approval was void. During discovery, some interesting facts came to light. When Brenda's attorney requested the Architectural Review Committee meeting minutes where the fence plans had allegedly been approved, the association couldn't produce them. There was no record of any ARC meeting discussing her fence plans. In fact, there was no record that she'd even submitted formal plans. In her deposition, Sandra, the ARC chair and Brenda's friend, admitted that Brenda had mentioned wanting to install a fence, but that formal plans were never actually submitted or reviewed. Sandra claimed she had told Brenda it would be fine, but there was no documentation of any approval process. This was huge. It meant Brenda had installed the fence without following the approval process at all, let alone getting approval for a design that violated the covenants. She had simply assumed that as president, she could do whatever she wanted. In March, the judge issued a ruling. He found that Brenda's fence clearly violated the unambiguous terms of the covenants, that she had failed to follow the required approval process, and that the board's subsequent enforcement action was proper. He denied her request for an injunction and dismissed her lawsuit. But the judge did rule that the daily fines should stop accruing as of the date of the ruling. By that point, Brenda owed $6,000 in accumulated fines. The judge gave her 60 days to either bring the fence into compliance or remove it and to pay the outstanding fines. Brenda appealed, which stayed the enforcement for several more months, but her appeal was ultimately denied. By August, nearly a year after the recall vote, she was out of options. I was working in my home office on a hot afternoon in late August when I heard the sound of power tools. Looking out the window, I saw a work crew at Brenda's house. Over the next 3 days, they systematically removed her spite fence. She had the contractors leave the fence posts and install a new 4-foot-high fence made of decorative wrought iron with large openings between the vertical bars. It met both the height and transparency requirements of the covenants. It also looked significantly better and more in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic than the imposing fortress she had built. Phil and I stood on my driveway watching the work on the third day, cold drinks in hand. $6,000, Phil said, shaking his head, plus whatever she paid for the original fence installation and now paying for the new fence, all because she thought the rules didn't apply to her. And legal fees, I added. Her attorney had to cost at least $15,000 or $20,000 for all that work. Expensive lesson in humility. If she actually learned anything, I said. As it turned out, Brenda put her house on the market in September. The listing went up showing her new compliant fence, though the photos were carefully angled to make it look as impressive as possible. She had several showings, but no offers at her initial asking price. She eventually accepted a lower offer in November and moved out in December. I never spoke to her again after the recall vote. On the day she moved out, I happened to be getting my mail when the moving truck pulled away. She was standing in her driveway, loading the last few items into her Lexus. Our eyes met for a moment across the street. I raised my hand in a neutral wave. She got in her car and drove off without acknowledging me. The February HOA election brought in a new board with several members who'd been active in the recall effort. Frank Morrison was elected president, and the new board implemented several reforms. They created clearer procedures for the Architectural Review Committee with required documentation and meeting minutes. They established a formal appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with violation notices, and they committed to consistent, even-handed enforcement of the rules. I was asked to join the board but declined. I had spent enough time on HOA drama and wanted to get back to just enjoying my house and my life. I did accept an appointment to the ARC, figuring I could help ensure that approval decisions were made fairly and consistently. The whole experience taught me several lessons about homeowner associations, power, and accountability. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining community standards and property values, but they're only as good as the people who run them. When board members forget that they're volunteers serving their neighbors and start treating their positions as personal fiefdoms, problems inevitably follow. The irony of Brenda installing a spite fence that violated her own rules wasn't lost on anyone. She had built a career out of zealously enforcing every minor regulation against other homeowners, finding violations in trash can placement and welcome mat colors. But when it came to her own property, she assumed she could ignore the rules entirely and use her position to rubber stamp her own non-compliant project. What made it worse was that if she had simply followed the rules from the beginning, she could have had a perfectly nice 4-foot decorative fence that provided privacy while still maintaining the open aesthetic the neighborhood was designed around. Instead, her arrogance and sense of entitlement cost her $6,000 in fines, probably $40,000 in legal fees and construction costs, and ultimately her position in the community she had dominated for 6 years. The $6,000 fine was just the direct monetary cost. The indirect costs were much higher. The stress of the recall and the lawsuit couldn't have been pleasant. Her reputation in the neighborhood was destroyed. And in the end, she felt compelled to move rather than continue living in a community where everyone knew her as the HOA president who had been recalled for not following her own rules. I sometimes wondered if she ever reflected on what had happened and recognized her own role in creating the situation. Did she understand that if she had treated other homeowners with the same leniency she expected for herself, none of it would have happened? Did she realize that the spite fence had been a monument to her own hubris, a physical manifestation of the double standards that eventually brought her down? Probably not. People like Brenda rarely have that kind of self-awareness. In her mind, she was probably the victim, unfairly targeted by ungrateful homeowners who didn't appreciate her years of service. The fact that she had installed an 8-foot solid fence in clear violation of the 4-foot transparent fence requirement was probably just a minor technicality that everyone should have overlooked. But the law doesn't work that way, and neither do HOA covenants. They're binding agreements that apply to everyone equally, regardless of position or status. When a board member tries to exempt themselves from the rules, they're not just violating the covenants, but breaching their fiduciary duty to the entire community. The legal case was actually pretty straightforward once it got to court. Covenants are contracts, and courts interpret them based on their plain language. The covenant said 4 feet maximum height with 40% transparency. Brenda's fence was 8 feet with 0 transparency. No amount of legal maneuvering could change those facts. Her argument that she had received board approval was undermined by the lack of documentation and the admission that she had never actually submitted formal plans. And even if she had received approval, courts have consistently held that HOA boards can't approve projects that clearly violate unambiguous covenant provisions. The covenants supersede board discretion. The judge's decision to cap the daily fines at $6,000 was actually generous to Brenda. The fines could have continued accruing throughout her appeal, potentially reaching $15,000 or $20,000 by the time she finally complied. But the judge showed mercy, perhaps recognizing that the $6,000 lesson was sufficient. For me, the experience was both exhausting and educational. I had never been particularly involved in local governance or community organizing before. I bought my house thinking I would just live my life, maintain my property, and maybe wave to the neighbors occasionally. I didn't expect to spend nearly a year organizing a recall campaign, documenting violations, and fighting against an entrenched board president. But sometimes circumstances force you to get involved. When I saw the blatant double standard and the abuse of power, I felt like I had to do something. It wasn't just about the fence, it was about the principle that rules should apply equally to everyone, and that those in positions of authority are accountable to the people they serve. The support I received from other homeowners was gratifying. It showed that most people recognized the injustice and were willing to stand up against it when given the opportunity. The turnout at the recall meeting demonstrated that the community cared about fairness and equal treatment, even if it meant challenging someone who had held power for years. Looking back, I'm glad I took action, but I also recognize that not every HOA dispute requires such an extreme response. Most issues can and should be resolved through communication, compromise, and good faith efforts on both sides. The situation with Brenda escalated the way it did because she was unwilling to acknowledge any wrongdoing or even consider modifying her fence to comply with the rules she enforced against everyone else. The new board has been a significant improvement. They still enforce the covenants, but they do so consistently and with common sense. They recognize that the goal is to maintain community standards, not to harass homeowners over trivial matters. They communicate clearly about expectations and work with homeowners to find solutions when issues arise. My own enforcement notices stopped after Brenda left. The violations she had cited me for were either withdrawn or resolved in my favor once an objective review showed they were either not actual violations or were examples of selective enforcement. The new ARC approved my rock garden, my house numbers, and even let me install a small fountain feature I had been wanting, which I never would have attempted under Brenda's reign. Property values in the neighborhood have remained stable, despite Brenda's warnings that relaxed enforcement would cause them to tank. Turns out that fair, reasonable governance doesn't destroy communities, it strengthens them. People want to live in neighborhoods where they feel respected and where the rules make sense and are applied consistently. The Facebook group for the neighborhood has become much more positive as well. Under Brenda's presidency, it was often a place for complaints and arguments. Now it's actually used for its intended purpose. Neighbors helping neighbors, sharing recommendations, organizing social events, and building community connections. We had a neighborhood block party last spring, the first in several years. Over 100 people came, including several families who had moved in recently and were eager to meet their neighbors. Frank gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their engagement over the past year and emphasizing that the HOA existed to serve the homeowners, not the other way around. People actually clapped. I ended up having a long conversation with Douglas Chen, the homeowner who had been fined $2,000 for his backyard fence. He told me the new board had reviewed his case and refunded half his fine, acknowledging that the enforcement had been excessive. He was considering installing some additional landscaping and actually felt comfortable submitting plans to the ARC now, knowing they would be reviewed fairly. These small victories mattered. They showed that the system could work when operated by people of good faith. They demonstrated that accountability wasn't just a theoretical concept, but something that could produce real positive changes. As for the physical reminder of the whole saga, Brenda's compliant fence still stands at what is now someone else's property. A nice family bought the house in December, a couple with 2 young kids who had relocated from California for work. I introduced myself when they moved in, welcomed them to the neighborhood, and assured them that the HOA was reasonable, and they shouldn't have any problems as long as they followed the basic rules. The wife laughed and said they had specifically looked for a home in an HOA community because they valued maintained common areas and community standards. "We just hope the board is reasonable," she said. "We heard horror stories about HOA presidents who go crazy with power." "We had one of those," I said. "But she's gone now. The new board is pretty level-headed." I didn't mention that she was living in that former board president's house, or that the decorative iron fence had replaced an 8-foot wooden spite fence that had cost the previous owner $6,000 in fines. Some stories were better left untold, at least until we knew our new neighbors better. The whole experience left me with a much deeper understanding of how HOAs work, both their potential and their pitfalls. At their best, they can maintain property values, provide shared amenities, and create cohesive communities with consistent standards. At their worst, they can become instruments of petty tyranny, with board members using their authority to harass neighbors and exempt themselves from the rules they impose on others. The key difference is accountability. When board members remember that they serve at the pleasure of the homeowners and can be removed if they abuse their authority, they tend to act more responsibly. When they forget that and start treating their positions as permanent power bases, problems develop. The recall process exists for exactly these situations. It's a safety valve that allows homeowners to remove board members who are failing in their duties or acting against the community's interests. The fact that it's rarely used doesn't mean it's not important. Its very existence encourages board members to act responsibly. In Brenda's case, she had gone unchallenged for so long that she apparently forgot she was accountable to anyone. She had built a small empire where her word was law, and she expected that to continue indefinitely. The spite fence was an act of breathtaking arrogance, a visible symbol of her belief that rules were for other people, not for her. The irony was that if she had simply built a compliant fence in the first place, none of the subsequent drama would have occurred. She would still be HOA president, still wielding her authority over the neighborhood, still finding violations in trash can placement and garden hose coiling. Instead, her insistence on having a fence that violated her own rules triggered a chain of events that cost her thousands of dollars, her position, her reputation, and ultimately her home. That $6,000 fine represented more than just accumulated daily penalties. It was the price of hypocrisy, the cost of believing that authority exempted her from the responsibilities she imposed on everyone else. It was a tangible measure of the community's refusal to accept double standards and abuse of power. I keep a photo on my phone from the day the original spite fence was being built. It shows the workers installing the 8-foot cedar panels while Brenda stands in her yard directing them, arms crossed, looking satisfied. Every time I'm tempted to let some minor injustice slide or avoid getting involved in something that doesn't directly affect me, I look at that photo and remember that silence enables abuse of power. The fact that over 100 homeowners showed up to vote for the recall demonstrates that most people recognize injustice when they see it and are willing to take action when given the opportunity. It's easy to be cynical about civic engagement and assume that people don't care or won't get involved. But my experience showed that when the issues are clear and the stakes are real, people will step up. The lawyers who handled the case on both sides probably made more money than anyone involved. Sarah Martinez's firm billed the homeowners supporting the recall around $12,000 total, split among those who contributed to the legal fund. Brenda's attorney likely charged her at least $20,000 to $25,000 for the lawsuit and appeal. The association's defense attorneys, covered by insurance, probably billed $30,000 or more. So the total legal fees involved in the fence dispute probably exceeded $70,000, all because Brenda wanted an 8-foot solid fence instead of a 4-foot transparent one and refused to back down when challenged. There's a lesson there about the cost of stubbornness and the expense of litigation. Most disputes can be resolved through negotiation and compromise for a fraction of what it costs to fight them in court. But sometimes people get so invested in being right that they're willing to spend enormous amounts of money to avoid admitting they were wrong. If Brenda had simply agreed to modify her fence when the first complaint was filed, she could have saved herself all the fines, legal fees, and humiliation. She could have worked with the new board to find a design that met her privacy needs while complying with the covenants. Instead, she dug in, lawyered up, and fought a battle she couldn't win. The judge's ruling was particularly damning because he found that the fence violations were clear and unambiguous. This wasn't a case of disputed interpretation or good faith disagreement about covenant language. The rules said 4 feet and transparent. Her fence was 8 feet and solid. No reasonable person could argue that complied with the covenants. For future homeowners and board members, the case established important precedents in our community. It confirmed that covenants are enforceable contracts that apply to everyone equally. It demonstrated that board members can't use their positions to exempt themselves from the rules. And it showed that homeowners have effective tools to hold boards accountable when necessary. The new board actually used Brenda's case as a teaching moment. At the annual meeting following her departure, Frank presented a session on HOA governance best practices. He used the fence situation as an example of what not to do, without mentioning Brenda by name. The key lessons were document everything, treat all homeowners equally, remember that you serve the community, and never approve something that clearly violates the covenants. Several homeowners who attended that meeting told me afterward that they found it incredibly valuable. It helped demystify how the HOA worked and encouraged people to stay engaged in the process. A few even expressed interest in serving on committees or running for the board in future elections. That increased engagement was perhaps the most positive, lasting impact of the whole situation. Before the fence controversy, most homeowners ignored HOA business unless they were personally affected by a violation notice. Now, meeting attendance was up. More people voted in elections, and there was genuine interest in how the association was run. The neighborhood felt more like an actual community rather than just a collection of houses that happened to share common areas. People knew their neighbors better because of the shared experience of the recall campaign. There was a sense that we had collectively stood up for an important principle and won. As I sit here on my back patio on a pleasant evening in late spring, watching the sunset over the desert mountains, I feel grateful for how everything turned out. My house is appreciated in value, the neighborhood is well maintained, and I have friendly relationships with my neighbors. The HOA functions smoothly in the background, enforcing reasonable standards without harassment or drama. And every time I drive past what used to be Brenda's house, I see that 4-foot decorative iron fence and remember that no one, regardless of their position, is above the rules. The $6,000 she paid in fines was an expensive reminder of that simple truth, but it was a lesson that needed to be taught. The spite fence she built became a monument to hubris, and its removal became a symbol of accountability restored. The whole saga took about 18 months from the day I first saw the fence going up until the day it came down. 18 months of meetings, legal filings, documentation, and stress. But in the end, the system worked. The rules were enforced, the double standard was eliminated, and justice was served. That's all any homeowner can ask for from their HOA.